Thank you, Mr. Rutherford, for having us here today. Thanks to everyone for coming in today. We're going to get started and hopefully give you an entertaining hour or so panel discussion. We're going to go ahead and have our panelists seated. As Skip said, my name is Lance Lamons with the Coalition for Public Safety. We're the largest national effort working to make our criminal justice system smarter, fairer, and more cost-effective. Our partner organizations, many of which you're familiar with, represent tens of millions of Americans who are seeking common sense reforms on criminal justice issues. These groups include the most prominent progressive and conservative groups in the country. I have to make sure, like a good NASCAR driver, to make sure that I list all 8 in my opening. The 8 partners, including the ACLU, Americans for Tax Reform, the Center for American Progress, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, FreedomWorks, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the NAACP, and Right on Crime. I would like to once again thank Skip Rutherford and the Clinton School of Public Service. Also thank the Arkansas Legislative Criminal Justice Oversight Task Force for hosting this event today. And once again, thank you all for participating. I'm so happy to be back in Arkansas. I'm specifically happy to be helping lead the discussion on the topic today that hopefully is very timely. Today we're going to discuss the Fair Sentencing and Fair Chances campaign for effective criminal justice reform. This is the first stop on the Coalition's national tour. We kicked this tour off in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago. Since then, we've been to Chicago. We have been to Austin, Texas, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're very happy to be here in Little Rock today. What we're looking to do here is to educate the public and to create momentum here in Arkansas that we've seen in many other states towards a more effective criminal justice system that reduces jail and prison populations, cuts incarceration costs, reduces recidivism, and removes barriers to those that are reentering society to allow them to lead more productive lives after they've served their time. As an Arkansan, many of the statistics, thanks to our friends at the Council on State Governments, who I know are here today, have provided many of the data points that I'd like to hit on briefly for you. They all deserve our attention. I hope everyone here becomes very familiar with them. The voters and taxpayers of Arkansas also need to be informed on exactly where we stand in the state. Just a couple of points. Between 2012 and 2014, Arkansas had the fastest growing prison population in the country, climbing almost 25%. This stands in direct contrast to some of our neighboring states, including Texas, which is represented in our panel here today. Crime shrank 32% in the state of Texas during that same time period, after the state enacted many reforms that you'll hear about today. For emphasis, I want to let you guys know, in 2015, the crime rate in the state of Texas is at its lowest since 1968. We all remember the tough on crime 80s and 90s and how nervous everyone in the country was, and the reaction and overreaction that we had both nationally and in the states. And I think that number addresses something that Arkansas should really look towards as a goal. Also, between 2005 and 2015, the Arkansas Department of Correction budget increased 62%. And I want to make a point here. For every inmate that we incarcerate in the state system, we could send a deserving Arkansas student to the University of Arkansas for a year. Let that sink in for just a second. And also, a third point I would like to make is that in 2014, almost 2/3 of admissions to prisons were violations of parole or probation, as opposed to people who committed additional crimes or are first-time offenders. So why we're here today is to let everyone know, including the legislators who obviously on this panel already know, but many of the other legislators who are hopefully paying attention to what the task force is working on, and also what we're talking here about today, that we can increase public safety. We can make the public safer while also reducing our prison populations and also reducing cost to taxpayers. All of these things are achievable goals, and hopefully the task force and moving into the 2017 legislative session can address a lot of these issues. Over the next 10 years, it's possible that Arkansas taxpayers are looking at over $1 billion in spending on prisons. This is both unsustainable and it's obviously ineffective, as we've not seen the drop in crime that many states have enacted reforms have seen. So what I'm asking here today is that everyone in this room, everyone on the panel has already done this to some extent, is that we all join together, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, progressives, whatever the side of the political spectrum you come from, whether you're a member of law enforcement, have a family in law enforcement, whether you're a victim of crime, whether you're a policymaker, whether or not you have, you are friends or family with someone who's been incarcerated or who has had a previous criminal record, that it's time to come together. It's time to break this cycle of incarceration, and instead it's time for a cycle of redemption and second chances for those that have been affected by the system. So enough from me. I'm going to introduce my esteemed panel to the left in the order in which they sit. To my immediate right is the Honorable Senator Joyce Elliott. Senator Elliott is the co-chair of the Legislative Task Force. She represents Senate District 31, part of Pulaski County, in the 89th General Assembly. Senator Elliott made me promise to make sure that her bio was brief. I will say she is a retired or reformed educator who got into the political realm. And, she still needs help. She still needs help. And Senator Elliott, I actually remember you from my time in the Huckabee administration. I remember you being a wonderful legislator and a great person to work with, and I appreciate you taking the time here today. And immediately to Senator Elliott's right is the Honorable Senator Jeremy Hutchinson. Jeremy won't let me get too far off into anecdotes, but Jeremy and I actually went to college together at Harding University, believe it or not, 20 years ago. It's hard for me, and I would say, can you imagine we'd be here today doing something like this? The sad part is I did imagine that we would be hopefully doing something like this here today. So Senator Hutchinson is in his second term representing Senate District 33, portions of Pulaski and Saline County. He's head of the task force, co-chair of the task force that helped bring us here today. Senator, I don't want to get too far into this, but all of the committees that you sit on, but obviously this is the most important one. We continue to look forward to your service on this task force and look to your recommendations for 2017. To his right is my good friend Jerry Madden, former state representative from the unfortunate or fortunate, however you look at it, state of Texas. Although I did threaten earlier, we're going to make him an honorary Arkansan for all of the work and time that he spends here in our state, trying to help Arkansas move towards reform. Also, Jerry doesn't like me to do this, but I have a nickname for him, and it's the Architect. To those of you who aren't familiar with Jerry's career, he is often referred to as the architect of reform in the state of Texas. The number I referred to, the 1968 crime levels, the number of people in Texas who've been incarcerated is down, and the cost to the taxpayers is also down. And it's through the work of Jerry Madden and his committee, many other like-minded left and right-leaning officials, and even the governor's office in the state of Texas. So we're very, very happy to have Jerry Madden, who's also representing Right on Crime here today, one of our partner organizations from the Coalition for Public Safety. And last, certainly not least on the panel, someone who's extremely important to this entire cause, and who was able to get our governor actually to the task force meeting this morning, which was very impressive that he took time out of his schedule to speak specifically to this issue. Kelly, thank you for being a part of that. Kelly Eichler is policy director for Governor Hutchinson. She has a career in law enforcement, on the law enforcement side of this, so she brings that perspective, which is very important to the discussion, both nationally and in the state. Having served on the State Board of Corrections, she's a former prosecutor, also a former criminal justice lawyer for Governor Huckabee. Her and I actually overlapped for a time in Governor Huckabee's office in the late 90s, and also has worked on juvenile justice issues for many years, including as a special judge in juvenile court. So with that, I've properly introduced everyone, and so I'm sort of going to open it up real briefly. I'm going to go down the line in order here. Senator Elliott, I'm going to be very pointed in this question and allow you to really move on to what you want to speak to, but I want to ask each of you, your work on the task force, your leadership on this issue, what are you looking to achieve, both legislatively and also public education-wise, on the need for criminal justice reform in Arkansas?
Thank you very much. We're undertaking some really big issues here, but what I hope to get out of that, one of them is not even a legislative response. I would like each one of us to think about the folks about whom we're talking about locking up, having on probation or a parole or whatever the case may be. I start from the premise of I am no better than any one of those folks. I am no better than the person sitting on death row right now. So something happened to cause that person to be where that person is, other than you're just a bad person. So I hope we can begin to think differently about the folks we call prisoners. If we begin to think differently, I think we can finally come to accept the ultimate thing that I think we need to accept after we're all just people, that what we've been doing is not working, and could we please stop doing more of it? And if we can get ourselves to that point, we can think about pointed and specific and targeted ways that we can help people before they get into the system. And when they come out of this system, we will see them as just people like us, and we give them a much, much better chance. As an educator, I knew that it was my responsibility to make sure every one of my students had more than one chance to get something right. That was just a part of the way it worked. Nobody sat in front of me and said, I'm here today because I want to be a failure. I think that's true of everybody who is a part of our incarceration system. So the big thing I hope we get out of that is thinking about people differently. And then when we begin to see people as people, just like the one we see in the mirror, we will bring different responses to what we're doing and stop doing the things we've always been doing, because we know it doesn't work. And I don't know how long we have to keep doing what we know doesn't work. And even more importantly, why we will double down on it and keep spending money on it and not find some better ways to deal with this as a humanitarian problem as well as a criminal problem.
Well, Joyce and I and Kelly, we were involved in 2015 session with the governor's office, which Kelly led the effort from his office. Spent hundreds of hours together working on the Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2015, which I won't go into all today unless it's specifically asked, but we did a lot of good things, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So this task force, part of that act was establishing this task force. And the task force is comprised of judges and prosecutors and public defender, well, criminal defense attorneys, and then somebody from the Public Defender Commission, as well as chiefs of police. Chief Buckner from here in Little Rock is on it, and sheriffs, and it's just a extremely well-qualified group of people that the purpose of which is to bring all different stakeholders together and try to come up with a solution. Now, defining what is a solution can be difficult in the legislature. My bottom line is I want to change behavior. We can achieve all sorts of successes, whether it be through the state budget, reducing the cost that we currently are incurring, and it's set to, as Lance mentioned, maybe triple if we don't do anything between now and 2025. So that would certainly be a big help to forestall that. But it's also lowering crime. Whatever we do, that's got to be our primary purpose, is to make sure that we're not endangering the citizens of the state of Arkansas. And then there's all sorts of getting people mental health treatment and substance abuse and just improving the lives of not only the people who we are servicing or who we are incarcerating, whatever the case may be, but also their families, who would say many of you probably have had families or loved ones who have dealt with an addict or with a mentally ill person, and it is a huge burden on the families. So I think by changing behavior, we can find all sorts of successes all across the state. The way we get there is through data. We have to set aside setting policy based on the headlines in the newspaper. And for as long as I can remember, that's what the state of Arkansas has done. It can be that a headline says prisons are overcrowded, and then we release Emergency Powers Act, we release hundreds, maybe thousands. It could be a heinous crime committed, as Darrell Dennis did a few years ago. Somebody who was on parole and he committed a heinous crime, and so we start revoking everybody, and we just go from one end of the spectrum to the other, not based on any data or scientific analysis, just based on politics of the moment. And so I'm hopeful this committee, this task force will, and we've contracted with Council for State Governments to help us with this, really delve into the data and follow the data and make wise decisions, and do what works, what's worked in Texas, what's worked in other states. It won't be we're not going to follow the lead exactly. There'll be unique things to the state of Arkansas, but whatever we do should be based on data and evidence and not just on emotions or politics. And I think that's the beauty of this task force. We'll have a year and a half or longer to be able to look at that and then together come up with a recommendation that I hope will give cover to the legislature to do some tough things, at least politically tough things, or at least potentially could be politically tough things, and we'll have that covered. The other thing that provides so much cover is Governor, who is a career law enforcement guy, from DEA director to U.S. attorney to Homeland Security, and yet he recognizes we have to do something different, and that gives us great leadership and great flexibility to operate under that we, without his background, we may not have. So it's a perfect time, kind of the perfect storm. We've got this task force, we've got a governor who's interested in the issue and has a credibility to be able to push it, and so I'm optimistic that we'll see some reform for sure.
And I'm the Texas guy who did some of these things to start with, and I've been honored to be up here with Senator Hutchinson when we were working last session on the legislation. Glad to have been here and talked to him and Kelly and some of the others about what we did in Texas. But how did this stuff really start? Where did it come from? And I'm going to tie that then to your commission, because I think that's the most important piece. Okay, first thing that I tell states and nations now is that the first thing you got to have is a mission. You do have that on your commission. Your commission does have a directive in the law of what it's got. We started ours in Texas when the speaker calls me in one day and says to this non-lawyer who'd never done anything in corrections, he says, "You're chairman of the corrections committee." And I said, "Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really appreciate that wonderful opportunity." And under my breath, I'm saying, "Oh, God, why me? What did I do to deserve this? I'd never had a bill, never been on this, never had any interest." And then he gave me the 8 words, because I asked him the second most important question in my life. I asked him, "Mr. Speaker, what do you want me to do?" And he gave me the 8 words that changed my life. He said, "Don't build new prisons. They cost too much." Now remember, this is a very conservative speaker telling me what was a conservative message, mostly about money, but I learned later on that it dealt a lot more things other than just money that we were dealing with. We dealt with lives and people and families and everything else. But to me, that was a conservative message that was the mission. Don't build new prisons. Now, I would suggest to my chairman friends to my left up here that maybe they look at their mission and say, can you make it even more pronounced so that everybody understands what you're doing, knows what we were working on? Because that's the first thing when we started working on stuff in Texas. Everybody knew that we were working on how do we stop from building new prisons? How do we keep from doing that? Okay? All right, second thing we learned from Texas that we did not do in Texas. I'll tell you what, the first thing I found was that there were not very many legislators who knew much about the subject of corrections. You'd be shocked, I know, to realize that that was the case in Texas. I don't think you'd be nearly as shocked to realize it's not the case in Arkansas. You have a lot of them that don't know much about it, okay? That's all right, it's normal, because they have other interests that they're working with. But I didn't find any until I went really over to the dark side of the Capitol, better known as the Senate, because I'm a House member. And I asked my Senate friends on the Republican side, since I'm the conservative Republican, I asked them, well, who over here knows anything about it? And they said, well, there's this one guy, okay? He's a Democrat. Texas, we are a little bit different. We have all our committees are led by loyalty to the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor, not to the political party. So it was not all Republicans were chairman, not all Democrats. He happened to be chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee in the Senate. But they said, the one thing that was important, they said to me, they said, we trust him in this issue. That's important. It's important that the parties between them build trust. This is how bipartisanship went into it. So you've got that on your commission now, because most of the groups that are doing this and talking about it says you've got to have it. Well, they're right. They got to have buy-in from the governor and the lieutenant governor, the chief justice, or people on your Supreme Court. They've got to have buy-in from the legislative leadership of both parties, both directions. They asked for that. We didn't ask for that. We just happened to wander. I happened to find the guy who knew about criminal justice in the Senate. And you know what? We sat down, and in an hour and a half, we just meshed like this on that subject. It was a meshing, all right? So we then started a process that actually talked to thousands of people. Jeremy may have spent hundreds. We spent thousands. Texas is a little bigger than Arkansas. We had a lot more people that were there that we needed to talk to, and a lot of different groups that we had to. We talked to them all. Boy, I'll tell you what, that was a killer. When you try to do that and get ready for legislative sessions, that was really, really hard. Lots of long hours trying to figure out, well, what do we put in this legislation? Because we didn't have groups like the Council of State Governments Justice Center. They weren't, I subsequently learned at that time that there were 2 of them that worked on justice reinvestment at that time. And other people had a couple, and we had our staff working on it. So we put those ideas together in a team, but the good thing that came out of Texas was the learning that you ought to put together a commission that helps you put together these ideas so you can help find out everybody's ideas and have everybody's choices. When I brought people in, I asked them 2 questions, which is stuff I would ask your commission. I would say to each commissioner, if you had to change one thing in your system in corrections, what would it be? And the second thing I asked my people is, what's the stupidest thing you think we do? It's amazing what answers you got, because they had different points of view and different perspectives on what should be changed, and you put together a lot of good pieces from that. And the second thing is, what was stupid, there were a lot of little things that bothered them. Failure of communications between the police and the local community and the judges and or the incarceration people. They didn't talk to each other in databases, or they had some reports that they were, why do I have to fill out 3 copies of this thing when I only need 1, and all this sort of stuff that you got lots of those things that you could deal with. The commission can deal with that. The third thing Senator Hutchinson pointed out that we did have in Texas, we were fortunate, which is part now of the Council of State Governments Justice Center, is we had data. We had data. We had lots and lots of data that told us lots and lots of things about lots and lots of groups and lots of programs and everything else. Okay? So we told them, basically, I wanted data. I'm an engineer by background. I'm not a lawyer, I was an engineer. So the engineer got to ask the questions. And the engineer was asking engineering questions of how does it work and why does it work or why doesn't it work? Because we had programs, in the prison systems, we had programs that didn't work. Guess what? We don't have them anymore. You can save a lot of money by giving a program that provides you with a 35% recidivism rate for people in the program, which, by the way, if you didn't give them any, you'd get a 35% recidivism rate. So, who cares? That's not a good program. On the other hand, we found out programs we didn't have enough of, like drug treatment for people in the prisons, like alcoholic treatment in the prisons, like specialty courts and things they could do to keep you out of, better things in the probation center. You find a bunch of those things when you start asking the engineering questions, the data questions. Where does the data leave you? And you follow that. That's what we had the chance to do. Those are the things that I will tell nations and states and everybody else that are starting or wanting to do that. Those are the things you look to put together, and remembering that there are stages of this. There's a first stage called the legislative stage. My friends will tell you that that's the hardest because they've been through some of that. Okay, it's not. The hardest part is implementation, making sure it's working, because you can really botch it and really put yourself back 20 years if you botch the implementation. And the third thing is then monitoring. And the fourth thing is changing if you screwed it up and didn't get something right. You have to have the capability to go back and fix it. So all of those things are part of what they're doing. They're on the first major step. It's a great step. Keeping the commission in place was an absolutely brilliant piece of legislation, my friends. So thank you.
Well, let me tell you, the easiest thing about returning to work after 15 years at home with 2 children was to be criminal justice advisor to Governor Hutchinson, who was head of DEA, head of Homeland Security, U.S. attorney. He doesn't need a criminal justice advisor, so I just fulfill a role where he can't be. what's been more comforting than anything is to know that Governor Hutchinson wants to restore the word justice to the criminal justice system. And by doing so, he doesn't want to be soft on crime. He wants to be smart on crime and make a difference in people's lives, not only those that are criminals, but those of us who are law-abiding citizens. I've been really inspired by people that have taken note of his leadership. Justice Wood on the Supreme Court has formed a committee on children and youth, which is looking at the juvenile justice system, and their adoption of a policy proposal is absolutely brilliant, and it's going to make a difference in that system. We're going to start collecting data from children who go into the juvenile system to transitioning to the adult system, and figure out, is that a single lane road, or are there diversions that we can make for those children who encounter the system? Another is I don't always agree with them. In fact, I fight with them regularly, but I have to give kudos to the Arkansas Sheriff's Association, who is pushing for more mental health treatment for people who are entering the juvenile justice system. I think for many people, learning that 75%, and this is just a figure that I learned this morning from CSG, was 75% of those who encounter the criminal justice system are out there walking among us in some kind of supervision, either on probation or parole. They're in your grocery store when you go there. I have to tell a funny story. When I was on the Board of Corrections, I brought home some cookies that were made at the prison that are like pecan sandies. I mean, they were probably better than pecan sandies. And I brought them home. My husband would not touch them because inmates had made them. And I asked him, I said, well, who do you think is working at the fast food restaurant? I mean, that's where they come from. So they are out there among us, and so we need to make sure that we get it right on the front end. The governor has a tremendous interest in looking at our sentencing guidelines. And you even heard this today that, well, you can fix it with clemency. Well, that's on the back end. We're talking about getting it right on the front end, making sure that the sanctions that we impose on people who commit crimes are sanctions that fit with what they need in their life in order to make them a more valuable citizen, a tax-paying citizen. And all of this is conservative, because if you're not complaining about crime, you're complaining about paying taxes, I assure you. And I got the figures. These are inconsistent with what was reported by CSG, but they are from the governor's budget person at DF&A, and so these are actual numbers. For corrections this year, we will spend $447 million of your tax dollars this year. That's to incarcerate people, that's to supervise people on parole and probation, that is to reimburse county jails for the backup because we don't have enough beds, and that is a $31.4 million increase from last year. And it will continue to go up. If the projections are correct, we can look at 10,000 more people incarcerated in the next 10 years. And we can look at in excess of $600 million to build new prison beds. So if we don't want to continue to go down this road, we're going to have to make some changes. We started that with the criminal justice reform bill, looking at diversions such as drug courts, veterans courts, like I said, making sure the sanctions fit the needs of the individuals who are coming to us in the system. So while we have a big job ahead, and we need cooperation and encouragement and interest and input from everyone, regardless of what your background is or what your angle is or what your agenda is. We need to hear from you. So, thank you.
Thank you all. We'll get into a few more specifics here. Kelly mentioned it, and Senator Hutchinson mentioned it again, and I'll just reiterate again. There is no one in America, no elected official, definitely no governor that I know of, with the law enforcement bona fides of our current governor. You're all familiar with his resume and his past in law enforcement. So having said that, the establishment of this task force should be a real wake-up call for all Arkansans that this is a serious issue that needs serious attention from elected officials, that someone of such a law enforcement background would appoint a task force of people who are intimately knowledgeable about the system. Kelly obviously knows the system inside and out, having actually worked inside the Department of Corrections and on the law enforcement side. So having said that, when the Arkansas Legislative Criminal Justice Task Force was set up, first I'd like, and Jeremy, I'd like to start with you. When the governor first approached you and prompted the establishment of the group, what prompted the establishment of the group? And second, I know that you guys met this morning. Many of us in this room were probably in attendance, but are there any updates as the second half of that question that you would like to share on what you guys discussed this morning?
Well, what prompted it was, like most things in government, just necessity. As we mentioned, we try to put together the Criminal Justice Reform Act 2015, and we started in early December, and session was in January, and we ended up filing the bill, I think, in the middle of February. But it's just too much. We didn't have time to meet with everybody we needed to meet with. Certain people felt like they had been excluded, though that certainly wasn't intended. There's just too much to do in a short period of time. So looking forward, the governor thought, and other states have done this as well, as Jerry mentioned, that we need a task force that will really look at it, spend solid year and a half, 2 years examining every bit of it, bring in everybody who wants to talk, and then come to with some consensus. So it's a far more inclusive process, and I think we'll have far greater success and far greater buy-in. That's not to minimize what we did in 15, because in a short period of time, I think we made some significant headway. What we learned today, we had a meeting presentation from Council of State Governments, their brief research that they've done so far, and Kelly cited some of the statistics that it's unsustainable. We cannot keep doing what we're doing. To me at least, the most impactful thing that I learned, and I've been hearing these numbers for years now, so that part wasn't new, but one thing that was new to me was our number of probationers, and correct me guys if I'm wrong, but I'm going from memory, our number of people in probation has gone down in Arkansas. The number of people incarcerated has gone up significantly. Obviously, we're the last year, well, at least 1 year, we're the fastest growing state in the country, and over the last couple of years, we're like number 2. So probation, if done right, and we've seen it done right, and we've made improvements on our probation system. We've got a great director who's really committed, not just to supervising, but also rehabilitating and treating and making sure people are given the services they need. But if probation is done right, it's the most effective thing we can do. Incarceration is the least effective thing you can do. I think without having data compiled yet, I think we can all agree locking somebody up, they're not with their families, they're not with their support group, they're not getting the type of treatment that they could get otherwise. While there is some programs in prison, it's certainly not what's available out in the real world. They can't get a job, they can't get skills, they aren't paying taxes, they're draining the system. So there's nothing efficient or effective about incarceration. And yet that's where we've had the massive increase, and the most effective tool we have, which is a good quality probation system, has been underutilized dramatically. So I think as we look forward, we have to start, first of all, improve our probation, and then use it. Use what works, and not incarcerate unless it's warranted. But that to me was the most compelling piece of information that I learned today.
Senator Elliott, obviously you've worked in this issue, you worked in the legislature, but what about this task force and its formation? What brought you to the table and made you want to serve a leadership role?
I was really attracted to our finally getting to the point of looking at this in a systemic way, because what we traditionally done, especially as policymakers and otherwise, Senator Hutchinson would pass a bill, I'd pass a bill, somebody else would pass a bill, and so we had all of these disconnected, disjointed kind of policies to respond to something that's a real problem. And I guess in 2013, part of the frustration I had with the recidivism was that there was no system to help folks once they got they were out of prison. There was no system to help them reintegrate into society. We have a great system for getting people into prison, but not to help them get out. And so I was able to get legislation passed that required us for the first time to set up a system of reentry. But that was just one thing. But I saw further with this task force, there was an opportunity not just to talk about recidivism as a system, but to talk about the whole structure and bring some common sense and reform to that whole structure. So I think it's really important that we take the time to think about this system and make recommendations to the full legislature based on not just this little part, that little part, but bring something that's going to be coherent. Because right now, there's not a real coherency to what we're doing. We're just one person or the other, getting something passed. And this is our opportunity to have some coherent policies and I think get much better results.
So Kelly, we know from your biography that your resume and your work history sort of brought you into this. So having said that, with the establishment of the task force and with the meetings already in the past and the ones that you'll continue to have over the year, what are your real goals for what you hope to see come from the task force?
My real goals. Well, I have small goals, such as reducing the county jail back up to 0, which, is tough. But real goals are seeing the success stories of people that have been in the justice system and have actually been rehabilitated. I've seen a few of those, but I think they're few and far between. Rather than someone going and doing their time locked up, but having those people that actually get their whatever issues they have addressed, such as addiction. Addiction is a huge issue. I think I'm not sure of the exact number, but I want to say it's somewhere in the 80s of the people that are incarcerated that have addiction issues, either to drugs or to alcohol. And I think if our justice system can actually make strides in treating that and getting people on their way to living productive lives, I think that would be a huge goal met.
Great. Actually, that leads me into, and because it was brought up 3 different times by all 3 of the folks that just spoke, one of the main pillars of the Coalition for Public Safety's Fair Sentencing and Fair Chances campaign is the emphasis on fair chances, or what we refer to as second chances, or recidivism reduction programs, however you want to frame the discussion. We do know that the cost to families. We obviously know the cost to taxpayers, but we also know the cost to families. We know that, as Senator Hutchinson mentioned, we have alternatives to incarceration that have proven their effectiveness in many places. So having said all that, with the 20,000 people in prison facilities across Arkansas that are at high risk of reoffending and reentering the prison system, that drives up our costs. We're not really seeing the improvements in public safety from incarcerating more people and from not giving alternative programs and opportunity to work. So my question for everyone on the panel, and Senator Elliott, I'd like to start with you. What can policymakers in Arkansas do to help? You've already obviously done some of this, but what are some additional things that you can do to remove barriers to those re-entering society? I referred to the cycle of redemption earlier, and hoping to eliminate some of the effects on our families and communities. What more can we do?
Well, I've introduced a couple of pieces of legislation I think that are headed toward that, although there are other things we can do. I think first thing probably, I wish everybody that I call civilians, like the folks in the audience, I hope more people will raise their voices about being supportive of second chances and redemption. About 2 sessions ago, I introduced legislation for banning the box so that folks would have an opportunity to at least make a first impression. It was met with, maybe disdain is overstating it, but that's pretty damn close. Because when I said at the very beginning, if we could change our way of thinking, that is informed by some of the opposition I have met with trying to get certain things done. And people took it very much as, well, you just want us to require us to hire people who are criminals and we don't look at their background checks. That is not the way it works, of course. The other thing I'd like to see the state do in that regard as well that is if we're going to hand out big fat contracts to a lot of people in the private sector, we ought to have the policy and we ought to require them to follow that same policy, because it doesn't mean that you don't get to do the background check. All it means is you give me an opportunity to come in and make a good impression. And we are never going to be able to do what we need to do if folks can't have gainful, meaningful employment to take care of their families. You mentioned families. The big collateral damage of all of this is what happens to families. And that's something, we don't deal with a great deal. And the other thing that I think we can do as well to help mitigate some of this is, if it's about legislation, is passing the legislation that I proposed on racial impact statements. Because the disparities in what we're talking about, it affects everybody. But the racial disparities are off the chart. And one of the ways I wanted to hold us accountable for what we're doing as policymakers is to ask us up front, before we do significant things with legislation, for us to carry out a racial impact statement to see if we're exacerbating a problem. And if we are, is there some other way we can achieve the same things? Those are just some of the things. Of course, there are a lot, but we don't have much time.
Well, let me tell you what we did in 2015, first of all, and you may not be aware of what all we did, certainly as it relates to reentry. First of all, for the first time ever, probation and parole will be able to offer treatment services. What we couldn't afford to hire counselors and just thousands of them across the state, but what we did do was instruct every point of entry, whether it be the sheriff's office, the parole, probation, wherever somebody enters the system, they'll be signed up on the private option if they're eligible, which most of them are. If, in fact, if they are eligible, they're all signed up, they can, as a condition of probation and parole, go get treatment for whatever their assessed needs are, whether it be mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment. That's the first time we've ever provided treatment. We've forever said, as a condition of your probation, don't do drugs. Well, it's an addict. And what's our likelihood of success? When you tell an addict, just go forth and sin no more, it's not, we're going to fail. And it has been failing. Then we revoke them. And we do a lot of intermediate stuff. Eventually you revoke them and send them to prison. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. And so what we've finally done is we're going to get you some help. And so that's a huge thing. Then we've set up social impact bonds, which we haven't implemented yet, but we're working on it. Department of Corrections and Community Corrections, particularly Community Corrections, are working hard trying to get these set up where we'd have investors investing in our provider community, saying, we've got this reentry program, we're going to do job training, we're going to do job placement, and we'll, maybe $20 million will be invested, and then that will be granted out. The investor is repaid by the savings that the state realizes by lower incarceration rates, by lower recidivism rates, by lower revocation rates. And those savings then will go to pay back the investor. It's going to be a special type of investor. It's not a typical, municipal bond issue or something, but I think we have people in Arkansas who are willing to engage with us and take that risk that we can. And then we've got a program that we set up that is still, again, going through implementation, but it's called the Pay for Success program. that if you take your own money, you don't go out and get a grant from the state, you take your own money and you invest. And we have a lot of people I see today who are working with our communities, trying to get them re-entered into society, get them a job, get them treatment. If somebody's willing to take a program, say, I'll take these 100 parolees, these 100 probationers, you can track my success, and if I can achieve a targeted, let's say 20% recidivism rate, then you'll, after 3 years or 2 years, we haven't figured out a certain number of years of demonstrating that type of success, I'll be able to share in the savings that my 100 people, by lowering the recidivism rate from 50% to 20%, that difference, I'll be able to share in those savings. So it incentivizes churches and the faith-based community and people who have a lot of needs out there, but it may incentivize them to engage on this and be able to help the state achieve those. So we can do that with two-year colleges who are willing to take, or also any entity who's willing to tackle that issue with us, we'll engage with them. And so that's stuff we've done. Again, it's not perfect, but we've made significant progress, and this task force will only continue that.
Jerry, can I actually go to Kelly here because I want to hear her perspective again, having been at the Department of Corrections, having seen the revolving door that we're talking about, and seeing many of the same offenders in which you had seen released back into society. So I want to hear your perspective on how do we slow the revolving door that we've talked about here.
Well, it's funny that you say that because you're right. Some of the same inmates are coming back, but then I go to the legislature, and the same questions are being asked that were asked 15 years ago when I was working. I'm like, it's deja vu. We're still talking about the same stuff, and nobody's making any headway. So I think we're making some real strides in doing things differently, and it takes an adjustment in thinking, just like the governor is talking about people who commit crimes. What we're wanting to do is change behavior. We're also wanting to change our attitude as well. I think that's huge. I didn't want to go off your question, but I had some brilliant thoughts that I felt the need.
Let's hear it. You got
I felt the need to share from what Senator Hutchinson said, is that, and the county, I'm not going to say the name, but the county in Arkansas that incarcerates more people than any other county also has the highest number of foster children. Now that makes you think, doesn't it? How this system affects families, affects children, and affects our future generation. And so it's much bigger than just, do we lock them up or do we not lock them up? It's a huge problem. And so anyway, I just want to leave you with that thought.
I got one I'm going to add to her, since I'm going to help her out with this, because the Council of State Governments Justice Center has their statistical guy who will tell things about it. Now, I'll bet you that same county has the highest number of school dropouts, and I'll bet that same county has the highest number of unwed mothers giving birth. And I'll bet you if you looked at a lot of other things that are there, that you would find exactly the same things statistically. If you plotted them, there are certain counties in Arkansas that would probably turn very dark colored, whatever it was, for locations and things, and others that didn't. I suspect that one would have a lot of those things that were overlapping. He shows that in a lot of the data that he does, okay? Recommendation first, because she talked about 20 years ago what people were talking about. Well, the first thing to do is start. Tell everybody, start doing this stuff. Well, you started, okay? You guys have started. That's a great thing that's out there. Second thing to learn, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of other states, as was pointed out this morning, who have done a lot of things. There are some wonderful things in their legislation that can be copied, stolen, taken by the senators as their own, whatever they want to do with them, and put them forward. Now, your governor happens to be a signatory on the program that I work with called Right on Crime. Right on Crime puts out a lot of papers and ideas on criminal justice. It might be a good idea to look at some of those papers and say, that the governor has at least voiced his support for this general organization. They're there. Third, there are legislative groups out there that are already working on stuff. Both the National Conference of State Legislators and the American Legislative Exchange Conference. ALEC has got model legislation. I guarantee you, in criminal justice, since it came from the committee that I chaired and which we put together working with others in this field nationally. Those recommendations are national recommendations that almost everyone in this room could grab onto and say, I really like most of those. Now, there might be some that you couldn't, but think how powerful that is for a liberal legislator to come up and say, well, this is an ALEC model bill, and say that to the conservative legislators. It does work. Same thing, the National Conference of State Legislators has done the same thing. They've gotten recommendations also on policies for the state, which could be taken and put together and used in this state. And the other state programs that are out there, I'll pick on North Carolina, for example. They've done a wonderful job on their probation and parole sides, particularly parole. Really good stuff that ought to be looked at. The state of Georgia, with their bills that they did, you know what? When they passed their legislation, when Georgia did it, they've done like 8 bills. 7 of them were passed unanimously in the legislature. Think of that. When's the last time that on a major piece of correctional bills has happened? The state of Alaska, since I've been there and done a lot of the work with up Alaska, their biggest argument on the floor when they did their bill last session was, who's the House author of the bill? Okay, that, for my legislative friends, is an inside joke. For the fact is that they wanted their own credit for the bill. They wanted credit for what was happening. All of them did. It's okay. Guys, there's plenty of room for credit for all when you do the kinds of stuff that you're working on. So don't hesitate. Each state is different. Each state. There are 51 different criminal justice systems in the country, including the federal. Okay, they're all different. Federals lock up about 11% of the prisoners. They get all the publicity, and the fact is 89% of the prisoners are in the states. Okay, I'm going to say one thing about what we did in Texas because it's good on the inside of people coming out. When we started in 2005, the parole board looked at 22,000 people and granted parole to 22,000 people. I shouldn't say looked at, they granted parole to 22,000 plus. 11,000 plus returned to prison that year, 11,000, over 50%. Last year that they had data on, which was 2 years ago, they granted almost 29,000 paroles. Paroles went up. Prison population went down, paroles went up. And the return to prison was under 6,000. Our number of people on parole has gone from 75,000 to 87,000. Number of people on parole is not a bad thing. That means that people are not going back to prison. That means they're out there doing whatever they're doing. Hopefully they're working. Hopefully they're in their community. Hopefully they're, being good citizens, or at least they're not coming back into the criminal justice prison system. They may, get into the jail periodically. I don't know about all of them, but they don't end up in your prison system. That's a reduction of almost 50% in the parole revocations that we've had in the state. That means that something's working. It means that the parole board has greater confidence because they'll look at the people that they can parole, and it means the parole system and division has a greater confidence because they'll keep people out and not send them back because we've given them the capability to do that. We have a lot of people on probation, but this last year, we reduced our prison population by another 2,000 people in the last year. Our probation people, our felony probation people are down 2,000. And our parole people are up, which we want to have. And our juvenile crime rate is down. And as pointed out, our crime rate's the lowest it's been since the 1960s, guys, and it continues to this date. Numbers that they saw today, I think they showed 39% reduction, 38% reduction in the crime rate in Texas, and about 11 or 12% reduction in the prison population. They can work. We closed 3 prisons.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to one of my favorite topics, and Senator Hutchinson is a longtime fiscal conservative. Governor Hutchinson, also very known for fiscal conservatism. Your family as a whole, mind you, even back, I remember your father in the state legislature, no tax Tim, so to speak. So I want. I know I have been around way too long. So I want to go to the cost, and Kelly gave us an alarming number from the Department of Finance Administration that was even higher than what Council of State Government's projections were. And Grover Norquist and the Americans for Tax Reform, Grover's probably maybe the most well-known tax fighter, and he came into this coalition with Americans for Tax Reform and their members. And so with the huge cost in the state of Arkansas, we've seen the cost at the federal system as well, but in the state system, what can we do? How can these recommendations help us reduce the cost to our taxpayers?
Well, Joyce and I, and certainly Kelly and the governor's office, we have a fiduciary duty to our taxpayers, to our citizens, to to be as lean as possible, be as efficient as possible. So I want you to imagine for a second that you had one prisoner who, not through your taxes, but you were responsible for paying for that one prisoner for life. And they were, some drug charge with intent to manufacture or something. What would you want to be seen done with that? First of all, would you want a 10-year sentence that you had to pay $28,000 a year for 10 years? Or do you think 3 years would suffice? If it's your money that you're talking about, not just through general taxes, but your money, I think most people would say, well, yeah, let's not keep him there too long. He can learn his lesson pretty quick. Then he gets out. What would you do for that one person? Hopefully by now you may care about them as a person, but even if you don't, just for your own pocketbook, what would you do? You make sure they get some treatment. You make sure they find a job. Make sure they're never going to go back because you don't want to pay anymore. You've already paid a year or 2 years or whatever the case may be, and by God, you don't want to pay anymore. You get them whatever help they need so that they can get a job and never go back and never take money out of your pocketbook again. Well, that's how we should look at it as legislators. I mean, we have a fiduciary duty to each taxpayer. That's their money, and we should act as you would act if you were in charge. And that's what we're trying to do. So I think that we have, like I said, fiduciary, moral obligation. There's a lot of, I love what Joyce said, but for the grace of God, there go I. My family's had drug addiction in its family. It's painful, and we ought to solve those problems because it's the right thing to do, or at least attempt to solve them. But the fiscal side, I think, is just as compelling, that we have a fiduciary duty to be as frugal with that money as possible and do what works, and not just be flippant about spending taxpayers' money. And locking somebody up for 10 years when 2 years would suffice is as big a waste of money as spending $150 on a hammer. It's still wasteful. And so we have to look at it. Now, we're going to let the data drive us, and we got a process in place, and we're not going to let dangerous people out. We're not going to, at least certainly not intentionally. There's going to be mistakes made, and that's one thing that we need the understanding of the public. Whatever change you make, there's going to be horror stories. And the person who successfully completes parole and has a job and is returning as a father to his kids, that doesn't make headlines. There's no news story about somebody who's succeeded. There are news stories only about those terrible instances which will occur if we do nothing or if we change everything up. It's going to happen, and we need understanding and support from the public that when we make these changes, it's not going to be the first instance. Let's revert and punish those stupid legislators who did this. You have to look at the data, look at what's working, and look at the overall aggregate numbers, not use a case-by-case scenario to attack people with.
Senator Elliott, we can talk once again about the savings to taxpayer dollars, but how do we effectively not only save taxpayer dollars, which is important, but how do we improve public safety through these reforms?
I suppose one of the things that we should remember just about human behavior is that probably most of us who are given opportunities to do something positive, back to my not being any better than anybody else. The reason I'm not going out taking and stealing is I have other options. And so if we were to think about this in terms of investment in our own safety, investment in our own state, we would probably not think so much about that investment as throwing away money or misusing taxpayer money. So I think if we are thinking about the money we're spending in that regard, we will get so much more bang for the buck because legislators won't be so hesitant about doing the things we need to do, like putting the money in probation and parole and helping people re-enter society. We won't be so hesitant about that because we're afraid of being called soft on crime. I can't tell you how much money we spend I mean, millions and millions of dollars because somebody would stand up and point at some elected official and say, you're just being soft on crime. That's a huge thing that the public needs to stop doing, because people react to that, especially in times of re-election. And we are spending taxpayer dollars in less than discretionary ways that are helpful because of what you will stand up and say. And we could be using the money, your taxpayer dollars, that we're spending on somebody who's a part of the criminal justice system, on pre-K, for example, which would directly impact us on that other end. We spend, a child's brain is 90% developed by the time they are 5 years old, and we spend about 10% of our investment on that end and 90% on the other end. So we are misusing taxpayer dollars in many ways because of what you insist on and because of what you will not allow us to do, because of it's so easy to demonize a person who has the ability to make that vote to do something different and better with those taxpayer dollars. And if we were doing something different and better with the taxpayer dollars right now, we would save money. And we would, because we would create taxpayers, and that's the ultimate thing we want to do, is create more taxpayers. And that way we can do more of the things that we want to do and have a higher quality of life in our state.
Okay, I've been told that we're up against the clock, and the reason we're gonna cut a little bit short because I want to give the audience opportunity to ask our panelists questions. So one last question. I'm gonna go down the row here, and Kelly, I'd like to start with you, please. Any reform efforts? I think we all agree. You have all reiterated this, that any reform efforts must have public safety as the first and foremost tenet of it. So how do we increase public safety while cutting on our incarceration rates and our incarceration costs?
Well, I think Senator Elliott has actually already addressed that. If you're putting people back out into society and they're employed and they're abiding by the law and maybe conforming to their parole requirements or their probation requirements, then I think you are increasing your public safety. And also making the changes in addictive behaviors and those issues as well. That's a huge step in the right direction for public safety.
And Jerry, Texas did this. It's been estimated that the state has saved up to $2 billion on the corrections since you left office. So how do we make sure that the public is safe, such as they are in Texas, back to 1968 levels?
Well, it's simple. First of all, you can use a phrase, another 8-word phrase that gets used sometimes. If Texas can do it, why can't you? It's always, Texas is notoriously as, soft on crime? I don't think so. Texas has got the notorious reputation of being very tough on crime. Right? So you can use our reputation that we did, but what we did made the public a lot safer by doing these certain things. First of all, treat people with an addiction problem. Break their addiction. If they're no longer an addict, what's their danger to the public? Well, it's certainly reduced one to us. You have a department called the Department of Corrections. You better measure your results based on how well you change a person from the day they walked in to the day they leave, and make sure that they're a better person when they leave. Okay, and that's the ultimate direction that you should have with the Department of Corrections. We treated alcoholics. We didn't have a program when we started this in Texas. We put a program in for alcoholics, multiple DWIs. Anybody think a drunk driving on the road is a danger? I do. I think they're a random killer. You know, I think that they're very dangerous to all of us. Okay, am I afraid of a drunk who's been at Alcoholics Anonymous for 5 years, hasn't taken a drink in 5 years, and is out working and with his family? I'm not afraid of him or her at all. Maybe people in this room that meet any of those qualifications. Okay? It's all right. They're safe. You know, they're not a danger to us any more than any other citizen is out there. But break their habit. You got to change the way they think. There's thinking class skills that you can give in the prisons. On cognitive thinking skills. Most important class I think you can give to prisoners is changing the way they think. Because the lady who was the executive director, or the deputy executive director in Alaska, once told me, you know, Jerry, I got two types of prisoners here. I got 30% who are really bad guys, who really ought to be here. And I got 70% that are knuckleheads. All right? Well, what you want to do, guys, is change the way knucklehead acts so that you're no longer mad at knucklehead. Because there are two types of prisoners that are there, the ones you're afraid of and the ones you're mad at. Knucklehead is one you're mad at. Knuckleheads gotten involved in gangs, gotten involved in drugs, gotten involved in doing stupid things, did you know, whatever it was, frauds or bad checks or hot checks or whatever Knucklehead did. But Knucklehead did knuckleheaded things. Change the way Knucklehead thinks, okay? And Knucklehead will be much less of a danger when Knucklehead walks out that door. And the other thing is you make sure you got programs that help integrate them back into the community, that help them, because the biggest problem you have is for a prisoner is the day they walk out. Things are so different than the day many of them walked in. They're not able to react very well. If you had somebody there to mentor them, help them from the second they walked out the door, they will in fact react much better. So there are various programs that you can do, and that's certainly the thing. Texas did those things. We're continuing to do them, and I think you're going to see our crime rate probably continue to drop, and I think you're going to see our prison populations continue to drop for some time because of these reforms.
Senator Hutchinson, how do we make sure the public remains safe and yet we effectively reform the system?
Well, first of all, we've got to lock up dangerous people. I mean, there's always going to be a need for prisons because there are truly, they may be a product of, you know, life circumstances, but they now are dangerous and they have to be locked up. So we've got to be able to differentiate correctly those who are knuckleheads and those who are dangerous. And that's going to take risk assessments, and it always needs to be monitored and updated. But absent that, the way that Texas and these other states have lowered their crime rates faster than Arkansas is change behavior. They've taken people who, because of inability to find a job, their addiction, their mental illness, whatever the issue, who would go out and commit crime, they've addressed those issues. And instead of committing crime, they're now tax-paying citizens and productive. And so the way we protect the public is make sure we lock up dangerous people, and then those who aren't, we get them the help they need and put them on the right path and supervise. And we need more money at our probation and parole so we can do an adequate job of supervising. And if we're doing that, then we don't need to incarcerate them because we're adequately supervising them. But we need increases and improvements in that as well. We're making progress, but that needs to be improved as well.
Senator Elliott, the last word on that question.
Well, I would just ask us to remember that Arkansas is a very small state, very small, and with that we act as if we have people to throw away, and we don't. And if we want to be safe, we have to get rid of that attitude, and as everybody has said here, work on developing people. And if we do that, we're going to have the bad actors there. There will be even easier to pick out if we invest in people, because we're going to find out we don't really have that many bad actors when folks have opportunity to have better lives. And I have yet to meet very many people who have opportunity to have a decent life, to go to bed the same way that I do at night, to have a family the same way I do, and are out committing crimes. Somebody has provided, and I have prepared for an opportunity to be an engaged person. That's what people need, and we just need to make sure they get those opportunities.
Once again, I want to thank our panel, and I'm actually going to grab this mic real quick, and I normally don't like to do this, but I told Senator Hutchinson when I first contacted him about possibly hosting this event, and Mr. Rutherford as well, and all the other cities that we asked to come visit their states and talk about this issue, that this is not Washington, D.C., this is not Texas coming in, because if there's one thing I know about Arkansans, we don't like being told what to do by other people. So we're not here to do that. We want to make this interactive. The folks sitting on the stage are the people that are going to make reform happen. So do we have any audience questions? And please, first of all, say who you are and direct your question to whomever it's appropriate. Yes, sir.
You select.
Oh. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Kristen Alexander. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. I have plans for after graduation to work in policy and advocacy for traumatic brain injured people. Oftentimes, the brain injuries are under-identified. They can lead to problems later in life or even starting early in life for behavioral issues, bad decisions, drug and alcohol abuse. How much on your radar are those issues, and are you working to address those specifically?
Is the question how much is mental illness and behavioral health on our issue, or particularly traumatic brain injury?
Well, traumatic brain injuries typically fall through the cracks between mental health and CLEs. They don't generally get classified as either, so often those people get overlooked.
Well, it's on our radar screen now. So thank you for the question.
Let me add something. In Texas, we had somewhere between 40 and 70% of our prisoners had some sort of mental problems when they were in there, depending on how you defined it. And one of the interesting things which you might research, I found out, at least from one of my professors at the University of Texas at Dallas, who said that 70% of these brain injuries are caused either by induction into gangs and certain gang-related violence items, or other things that were reactive to the prison environment. It would be great to really know the factual information about that, whether that's right or wrong.
Thank you. My name is John Sarna. I do a number of things, including hosting a weekly talk radio program for Station KVF, little plug there. I've got a lot of questions, and I'll try to boil them down to two. But before I ask the questions, I do have a very strong recommendation. Last year, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers published a report called Collateral Damage, in which there are specific suggestions pointed out after several years of research of what can be done when a person is out. And it is a report that is very well, easy to read, very readable, not designed for just lawmakers. It is also designed for the general public. My recommendation is, for those of you who are not familiar with it or who may have heard about it but not yet read it, please make it required reading for anyone who is going to be involved in criminal justice reform. That's my recommendation. Now, two questions. The first question: you bring up a lot of very, very good points, but it strikes me that one way to have a stronger assurance that the reforms are going to work is to apply them to all categories of felonies without exception. Without exception. To get that done, are members of the panel, are members here willing to talk in depth with people who represent various criminal justice reform groups? There are at least 3 in this room right now who are listening. That's my first question. And Senator Elliott, you largely answered my second question, but Arkansas being Arkansas, you have access to information, to study, data, reports, statistics, everything that the average voter, say in Newton or Craighead or Chicot counties, are not going to be aware of and maybe not have access to. And yet, when re-election comes around, you're going to get someone saying, "Me tough on crime," especially at re-election. Okay, how do you work it in the political arena to counteract things like that? Those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
To the 2 current electeds, I'm going to let you guys choose how to answer the political question.
Well, first, John, I mean, you and I have met, and I think you know I'm willing to meet with anybody. And am I prepared to? I don't exactly know what you mean by applying it across the board to every single felony, but I think I know what you mean, and we need to talk about that, because I think some felonies are more dangerous than others. But to the second question, I think Senator Elliott nailed it. First of all, we've got a strong argument using evidence that this does not increase the crime rate. In fact, it reduces it. The reforms we're making are common sense. If it was applied to you and your budget, you would do the exact same thing in your household budget. And they were more effective, they're more cost effective. Intellectually, you can make a very compelling argument. problem is in campaigns, intellectual arguments are worth nothing. What matters is a 30-second soundbite or a push card that goes out, and that's going to require voters to be more discerning and to ask questions and dig in a little bit deeper than just taking a 30-second ad and taking it as gospel. It's not a problem that we can do our best, but ultimately it's going to be the voters that are going to have to solve that problem, not us.
Yeah, I do agree. And just real quickly, I cannot overstate how much you're going to have to be a part of this Me Tough on Crime thing that you're talking about, because one of two things will have to happen. All of us should have a few issues for which we're willing to be unelected, and this could be one of those issues. And nobody wants to be unelected. And with that, and whatever happens to the public, when you love to tell us, you know, we love people who are themselves and they state the facts as they are. And every time you do that, you need just a crowd of people behind you backing you up. But when you turn around, and I'm really serious about this, the crowd is nowhere to be seen. And then that person that you're depending on to carry that load and to carry the voice, you don't even have that person in office anymore. There's no point in being excited about somebody being in office if you're not going to support them when they take hard stands. And that's a lot of what we don't do.
There's a couple of things that are out there that you do see around the country. First of all, I highly recommend you see bringing these groups in. I'd highly recommend to the commission that they either be part of the commission, or if they're not part of the commission, at least they be closely tied to one or more commissioners and specifically get those ideas brought forward before the commission. They should present them. Obviously, they should be part of it, because we did that in Texas. I found I had think tanks on the right and think tanks on the left, and guess what? I brought them both in, and I found out that they agreed on 80% of the stuff in this area. Okay, well, 80% is a pretty good bill. I got lots of complaints of people that said, gee, you only picked the low-hanging fruit. Well, I'll guarantee you there's some people out there that have reached for the highest part of the tree and got nothing, fell off and broke their necks basically on an issue, when if they'd have gone out and done what we did and picked the low-hanging fruit, first of all, the tree gets better. Second of all, you make lots of steps, and some of those things that were low-hanging, that you thought were low-hanging, are actually very, very important in getting the stuff that's done. So I would highly recommend go out and pick a whole lot of low-hanging fruit, and those things that are way high on the tree might be better off waiting for the next time around, because you don't want to wreck the chance of passing the legislation that does major things, to be able to pick up one more piece that may be important to some, but is not important enough to the others. So I would highly recommend.
Folks, I'm sorry, we are out of time. Obviously, we have two elected officials and other folks here who are very accessible. Please feel free to send in your questions or call their offices. I want to leave you one quick thing, and then I want to plug the Coalition for Public Safety and state partners. All of the partners involved in this effort are willing to. Our goal is to educate the public, and it's also our goal to educate elected officials as well. So. This program is orchestrated to lay out a baseline for reform, and we want to do two things. We want to make sure that punishments fit the crime, and we want to make sure that we address the lifelong consequences of criminal record. And thank you for your time today. We really appreciate your participation. Thanks again to our wonderful panel.